Welcome to everybody. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. A very warm welcome to all of you from Kansas City in the US heartland. My name is Jutta Behnen. I'm the director of the Goethe Pop-Up Kansas City. We are a mini branch of Germany's Federal Cultural Institute, the Goethe-Institut. I welcome you today together with our program coordinator, Julia Pataki, who is handling all the technology. She will remain invisible for you, so I'd like to take the opportunity now to say thank you, Julia. Doesn't it feel like being in this virtual world forever? I'm sure you miss in-person events as much as we do. But every cloud has a silver lining, and so we are more than proud to present to you today 4 acclaimed speakers from both sides of the Atlantic. Susan Neiman from Berlin, Germany, Patrick Weems from Summer, Mississippi, Glenn North from Kansas City, Missouri, and Dave Tell from Lawrence, Kansas. Today's panel discussion exploring monuments and places of remembrance in the US and in Germany, and asking about approaches to reconciliation or the discomfort of remembrance, as we phrased in our event title, takes place in the framework of a large regional project called Shaping the Past, or in German, Gestaltung der Vergangenheit. With our partners Monument Lab and the Federal Agency for Civic Education, we, the Goethe-Institut North America, invite you to explore, together with artists, activists, and intellectuals, how we remember the past and what implications this has for our present and future. We just posted the link in the chat where you can find out more about this project. Before we will begin the discussion, let me briefly introduce you to some housekeeping rules. This event will be 90 minutes long. It will be live streamed on Facebook and also recorded, and will be made available on our Vimeo page soon. After my welcoming remarks, I will give the floor to our moderator, Dr. Dave Tell, who will then open the conversation between today's speakers. This conversation will be around 40 to 50 minutes, and then we would like to hear from you and invite you to a Q&A. Since all attendees are muted during this event, we encourage you to use the Q&A box that you find on the bottom of your screen. You can post questions at any time during the event. When you do so, it's always great to know where you're joining us from. If you like the idea, please introduce yourself with your name and maybe your city. Now, I would like to welcome our today's moderator to join me on the screen, who is also an expert on the Emmett Till case. Dr. Dave Tell is Professor of Communication Studies at the University of Kansas and co-director of the Institute for Digital Research in the Humanities. Dr. Tell is a founding director of the Emmett Till Memory Project, and his writing on the Till murder has been published nationwide. His book, Remembering Emmett Till from 2019, was listed as a Book of the Year by The Economist and winner of the Mississippi Historical Society's 2020 McLemore Prize. Welcome, Dave. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Yuta. It's such a pleasure to be here, and I'm so excited for the panel. I'll begin by introducing our 3 panelists and then pose a series of questions to them, and I know this 45 or 50 minutes is going to go in a heartbeat. Joining us from Germany is Susan Neiman. Susan was born in Atlanta, Georgia, and now lives in Berlin, Germany, where she is the director of the Einstein Forum in Potsdam. She studied philosophy at Harvard and at the Free University of Berlin, before becoming a professor of philosophy at both Yale and Tel Aviv University. In her latest book, Learning from the Germans, Race and the Memory of Evil, she compares the memory practices of her native region, that is the American South, with the memory practices of her adopted home in Germany. The result is a series of lessons from Germany, and we will get into these in due course. Second, let me introduce to you Patrick Weems. Patrick is a co-founder and executive director of the Emmett Till Interpretive Center in Sumner, Mississippi. The center uses art and storytelling to share the Emmett Till tragedy and facilitate racial healing. Patrick is a graduate of the University of Mississippi. He holds a master's degree from the Center for the Study of Southern Culture, and he was recently awarded a fellowship from both the W.K. Kellogg Foundation and Monument Lab. Patrick and I have worked closely on Till commemoration for the past 6 years, and full disclosure, I count him as a close friend. Finally, Glenn North, just east of me in Kansas City. Glenn is the executive director of the Bruce R. Watkins Cultural Heritage Center, and also a co-liaison for the Equal Justice Initiative and Community Remembrance Project of Missouri that initiated the installation of the Levi Harrington Memorial, the first marker remembering a victim of lynching in Kansas City. Glenn is a spoken word artist and the author of City of Song, a collection of poems inspired by Kansas City's rich jazz tradition and the Black experience. I'm going to kick off our panel with a prompt for all three of our panelists to consider. And I want to put the prompt like this. Susan's book is about an 8-syllable German word that I won't pronounce for you, but it translates to working off the past. And I actually love that idea of thinking about memory as a form of working off the past. To me, it sort of suggests that remembering doesn't come naturally, that it's not easy to do, that memory is a form of work and a form of cultural labor. And so maybe the best way to introduce you to our three panelists is to invite them to share what memory work looks like in their own settings. Let's start with Susan so she can introduce us to the word and the concept, and then we'll move to Glenn and to Patrick.
Gotta unmute myself. Without a concept, it's actually quite hard to talk about what needs to be done. And the concept, as well as the process, was invented in Germany. In case there are any Germans listening, and I know this is a Goethe-Institut event, you know, I have to preface my remarks by saying I know the German process of working off the past was very far from perfect. It was very slow, and it was a long time in coming. The book has actually been much, people like it much more in the US, which surprised me a little bit. I thought that Americans would hate being compared to, you know, the country that produced the Nazis. But as a matter of fact, after several years of Donald Trump, the comparison no longer seemed shocking. Germans, on the other hand, insist that they didn't, or good Germans, that they didn't do enough, that it wasn't well done enough, that it's, you know, not perfect, that there's still racism and anti-Semitism, which of course really confirms my thesis. That is, this self-criticism and also this idea that the work is never done does very much belong to the process of working off the past, or Vergangenheitsaufarbeitung, as they say in German. And it's a multi-layered process. It involves finding a true narrative of your country's history, but that's not something that can simply be done in school books, although one does need to think seriously about what's taught in schools. Popular culture plays a huge role. You know, movies, art, music. I'll just give you one little example that occurred to me too late to put in the book, so I put in the afterword. I was driving on the New Jersey Turnpike and trying to stay awake late at night, and I start singing along with the radio, and along comes Joan Baez's cover of The Night They Drove Old Dixie Down. And I suddenly realized I can't sing that song. You know, it would be like singing The Night They Drove the Wehrmacht Down. And the crazy thing is that Joan Baez's civil rights creds are impeccable. I mean, she not only sang at the March on Washington, she sang in Selma when white people were getting killed in Selma, you know? So the degree to which the lost cause mythology has permeated our national culture, not just in the South, is, the kind of thing that needs to be faced and worked through. Monuments and statues are a part of that process, but it's a multi-layered, and I believe also a multi-generational process that has indeed begun in the United States, but that the Germans have some, decades of on us on that. I mean, I could go on, but why don't we hear from
That's
the
great.
other?
Thank you, Susan. I already have my follow-up in mind, but first I want to hear from Glenn and also from Patrick on the memory work and their spaces.
Well, first of all, I just want to say how great it is to be here and to be sharing the panel with you all, talking about this very important topic. I've done work in several different Black cultural institutions, the American Jazz Museum, the Black Archives, and now, of course, here at Bruce R. Watkins. And I think that one of the things that is important when we talk about memory work is the audience, right? I think oftentimes we think of history as an academic pursuit, or as Susan was saying, something that we think in an educational context. But in these spaces, I've learned that it's the work of community. It's telling our local stories of what has happened in our sphere of influence, and how that can kind of impact the way we see the world. I've oftentimes in these spaces come across white patrons who are visiting the museums to learn more, who are authentically interested in understanding, our country's racial history better. And they oftentimes are very upset and frustrated that there were certain things that they hadn't learned in the history book. So I think memory work is also about filling in those gaps, right? Telling those stories that are oftentimes overlooked, or correcting those stories and historical narratives that have been distorted. I've heard people say that the South lost the war, but they won the narrative. And so when we talk about songs like the one Susan referred to, how that shapes the way we think about the past. And just finally, really quickly, I think when we talk about memory work, it's the language we use. It wasn't until I started talking to Judah and Julia about appearing on this panel that I even came across the term memory work, right? And I think that connotation gives us a different way of looking at how we study and view history. And I think language is important. Recently there were a lot of debates in Texas about the verbiage that was going to be used in history books, and referring to the slave trade as the transatlantic trade, referring to people who had been enslaved as immigrants, referring to colonialism as expansionism. These kind of things are all a part of the many layers of this work.
Yeah, I'll agree with Glenn that this work is, in our perspective here in Mississippi, has been very local. It's definitely been influenced by pop culture and larger society. I think about movies like Mississippi Burning and Ghost of Mississippi that had kind of mass appeal, but then impacted the local. But our story in Tallahatchie County, where the murderers were from, and where the trial of J.W. Milam and Roy Bryant took place, two of probably 8 murderers of Emmett Till. Our community, as Dave notes in his book, it took, what, Dave, 49 years and 11 months? Is that it? 49 years and 11 months. 11? Yeah.
49 years.
Until we put up our first historical marker in the Mississippi Delta acknowledging the words Emmett Till. And that was just an Emmett Till Memorial Highway. Our community was silent for 50 years around Emmett Till. It's a huge stretch of time, and the silence speaks volumes. Our work was really informed later on by the Philadelphia Coalition that had the same type of silence around the 3 civil rights workers that were killed in 1964. Their community was silent and had this kind of narrative publicly, nationally, that nothing had ever changed. And that upset the local community, that they felt that there was progress happening on the local level. So they created the Philadelphia Coalition, a multiracial group of citizens. They got together and immediately started talking past each other. The Black citizens and the white citizens and the local Choctaw, Native Americans just really couldn't, they were speaking the same language, English, but they were speaking past each other. So it wasn't until they really developed relationships and trust that they really were able to listen to each other. Out of that process, they decided not to create a memorial to the 3 civil rights workers, but instead go after Edgar Ray Killen, who was the mastermind behind the murder. He was a KKK member who'd never gone to jail because he was a preacher. And so 41 years to the date of the murder, they finally were able to do a call for justice that led to that conviction. And it was the first time that local Mississippians had ever done anything like that. So we like to say that reconciliation is great, but the prerequisite is justice. You can't have healing without justice, that they are tied together. So our community in Sumner saw what they did and decided to do our own reckoning. It was, again, 50 years, and a cold case had already begun, thanks to a guy named Alvin Sykes, who's from Kansas City. If you don't know him, Google him. We might mention him later. Just a phenomenal hero of kind of reopening cases, just an incredible person. We decided to go the route of apologizing for our role in the injustice and to begin to put up historical markers and to restore our courthouse back to what it looked in 1955. And it's been definitely a journey. I think eventually we'll show some pictures, but just the context of doing this in a town of 400, a county of 15,000, it hasn't been easy, but it's the right road for us.
Thanks, Patrick, and thanks, everyone. Y'all picked up on a lot of threads. We're going to be developing over the next half hour, things from narrative to a national narrative to local work, and maybe even, if we're lucky, to the Kansas City story of Alvin Sykes. But before we get to that, let's start with Susan's basic call for a self-critical memory practice. And I just want to say the name of her book out loud again because it's worth it. It's called Learning from the Germans: Race and the Memory of Evil. And if you haven't seen this, I see some in the comments that you guys have already read this book, but I assure you it's worth the time and investment.
Thank you.
I gotta say, I don't think the United States has ever been particularly good at a self-critical memory practice. We're good at remembering glorious deeds, and we're pretty good at remembering our victories, but we're rather less practiced at remembering our national sins. As Susan points out in the book, the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. predated the Whitney Plantation and the EGI Memorial by decades, right? And to me, that suggests that we have a memory practice that's indexed to other people's shortcomings, but perhaps not a memory practice that's indexed to our own shortcomings. A possible exception might be the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. Don't shake your head just yet, because if you remember, it was early 80s. The memorial gets put up in DC. And if you remember the reaction to it, right? The reaction was so severe, and it was called like a black gash of shame or some such, that the artist Maya Lin was forced to add 3 relatively heroic, brave-looking soldiers that sort of totally don't fit the aesthetic, just to like make Vietnam into a positive memory. And to me, that says Americans simply could not bear a self-critical memory practice. So let me pitch this. Susan's jumping in. Let me pitch it both to Susan, to Glenn, and Patrick, and ask you guys, have you guys seen a self-critical memory practice, and what have the responses or reactions or resistances been to that practice?
I'm sorry, I really have to disagree with you about the Vietnam Memorial, which I find outrageous, although I'm also old enough to remember that at the time it seemed like it was critical. It might be considered moderately critical if the memorial contained a reference to the millions of Vietnamese who were killed in that war. You know, their numbers, if you like, even if not each individual name. We have not had a national reckoning with Vietnam at all. We discussed it a lot. Now, I'm older than all of you, I bet, so I can actually remember discussions that went on when the war was happening and, you know, what business we had in this war at all, and the ways in which it was in many ways a very unjust war. But that discussion has not taken place at all. And the memorial skirts it entirely. I mean, we sent pilots who we, you know, call heroes to bomb North Vietnamese civilians from the sky. For exactly what reason? Because we decided that their country should be differently run. Sorry, I cannot agree with you about the Vietnam Memorial. And, you know, once we deal with, let's say, our original sins, which happened with the expropriation and murder of Native Americans and the theft and enslavement of Africans, you know, I hope that we'll get on to thinking about some other things. I should say that I don't think facing one's history only means looking at all the crimes that people have committed. I think there are a lot of unsung heroes, or heroes who have been sung to, you know, too softly, who we also need to remember. And that's something that Brian Stevenson said to me when I interviewed him in Alabama. So I'm not arguing for the idea that there's nothing good in American history, nothing that, you know, deserves lifting up. On the contrary, but I think a grown-up relationship to your nation's history is like a grown-up relationship to your parents, you know? Your gratitude for what they brought you that you'd like to, you know, pass on to the next generation. But you can also criticize some things that, you know, you wish they hadn't done.
Yeah. Yeah, Susan's book is great on calling for a nuanced memory practice, right? And memory doesn't always lend itself to nuance. But I love the metaphor of a adult relationship to your parents. Glenn and Patrick, back to you guys. Where do you see an embrace of or a resistance to a self-critical memory practice?
Well, there's definitely a shortage of it here in Kansas City, Missouri, which is why I think the Community Remembrance Project is so important. And Susan's metaphor analogy was one that I had really reflected on last night. And not to go too far afield, but you know, my family, my parents split when I was 8 years old. It was me and my younger sister. And my mother, about every 4 or 5 months, revisits that period where our family was experiencing that being disrupted. And she reflects with me, how do you remember this happening? And how do you remember that happening? And she apologizes to me often for things that she feels that she could have handled better. And that has done so much in terms of reconciliation and healing for our relationship. And so if we were able to do that on a local or national level, I think that would go so far in terms of like true reconciliation and repair. The spaces that I've worked in that I mentioned, the American Jazz Museum, the Black Archives here at Bruce Watkins. The other part of that is what Susan, I think, talked about, really telling the stories of those heroes, people who were advocates for social change, people who put their lives on the line to make our city and our country better. And I think that it's very important to tell those stories, and as Susan said, not to always just focus on the negative things that happen.
Yeah, I'll just add this. The unsung heroes, today is the 65th anniversary of Rosa Parks refusing to give up her seat. And many people don't know the name Dr. T.R.M. Howard, who was holding mass meetings in the Mississippi Delta in the 1940s and 50s. Thousands of people in Mount Bayou, an all-black town that had a black mayor, a black sheriff. Dr. T.R.M. Howard came, housed Mamie Till during the trial, but then he also went to Montgomery and told the story of Emmett Till at the church where Dr. King was the preacher. And so I think there's that those nuances and stories, those hero stories, are just as important as these tragic stories, as these stories that are difficult to tell. So I want to lift that up. I don't know if that answers your question, Dave, and if you want us to drill down on your question, we can come back to it.
No, that's great. I'm going to jump around in my questions, taking a cue here from Tim Galsworthy over in England, who submitted a question online, and it's a question that I had in my notes. So the stars are aligned here. Thank you, Tim. He's pushing us to talk about dates. It was 2018 that Kansas City finally erected a memorial to Levi Harrington. In 2019, Susan's book was published, and shortly after the book was published, Patrick and his nonprofit erected the country's first ever bulletproof memorial. And I imagine for all of you, if you take yourself back to 2019, you probably never could have dreamed the ways that memory practices would be at the forefront of the public imagination in 2020, right? I'm thinking of all the statues that have come down and the statues that are still standing. I'm thinking of the flags it's now a different flag flying over Patrick's courthouse in Mississippi. I'm thinking of the 1619 Project and the 1776 Commission. I'm thinking about Colonel Reb and Silent Sam, about Dustin Klein's art installation on Monument Avenue, and even the Mellon Foundation's $4 million commitment to think about our commemorative landscape. And so let me just ask each of you, how do you feel about our memory culture in 2020? Does this feel like a hopeful moment to you? Does it feel like an ominous moment? Have we reached a turning point? Whoever wants to take that is welcome to.
So I'm happy to start because I've thought a lot about this. I think that an American working off the past began in June 2015 when President Obama gave the eulogy for the 9 churchgoers murdered in Charleston, because that was the first time that a national politician called attention to the ways in which our not examining the violence of our past has led to violence in our present. And that was an extraordinary moment. And of course, you did have 2 southern states taking down flags and Walmart saying that they weren't going to sell Confederate memorabilia anymore. And that was actually the moment for me where I thought, hey, America's starting a Vergangenheitsaufarbeitung. And, I've been thinking about this for a while. Maybe there's something I can contribute. What I think has happened in the intervening 5 years is that we have seen with horrible clarity what happens when a nation does not examine the violence of its past. I don't think there's any serious disagreement about the idea that the entire presidency of Donald Trump was a backlash to the fact that for 8 years you had an extraordinary Black family living in the White House, all of them with grace and intelligence and dignity. And, they became role models for all of us. I mean, including many white people, as far as I'm concerned, they're role models for me. And that enraged those people who had not dealt with, the racism in the past. And, it's been bubbling now. You can name a bunch of dates. Charlottesville was a turning point, if you like. But it's been, stewing until the murder of George Floyd sort of burst something open in people. And I have, by and large, been very hopeful. I'll say I was totally hopeful in June and also hopeful in July. There's some things that I worry about. I worry that we search too quickly for kind of, general and abstract solutions. Every monument of this type has got to go. What I would like to see, and I know what Patrick and Glenn are working on, are really community-based discussions in which communities take it on themselves to talk about which monuments they want to preserve, which they want to contextualize, which they want to, put something facing it, and in particular, in which people talk about what they want to put in the place or in addition to the monuments that they decide have to go. But in general, I'm quite hopeful.
I feel hopeful as well. As a poet, language is very important, and I think that certain terms have kind of changed the perspective for white people in particular when we talk about race. So we talk about white privilege. Like if I were to say to a white person, do you think that you're a racist? They would, vehemently deny it. But if I say, do you think that you experience privilege? That's a little more palatable. And then when you talk about privilege, like why does that privilege exist? And it exists because of white supremacy, the institutional power that white people have to disenfranchise one group of people and empower another group of people. So this white privilege, I think this term has been very helpful in getting white people to understand racism better. White fragility, the proliferation of that term and helping white people to understand why they are sometimes resistant to having these discussions about race and about the history of America as it pertains to race. And so I don't want to sound naive, but what I think I saw happening this summer, if my eyes weren't deceiving me, is that there were more white people on the front lines, more white people who were engaged in the conversation. And ultimately, racism is a white people's problem. You know what I mean? Like, although Black people are impacted by it, I think that if it's ever really going to change, it's going to be white people who are going to have to really take responsibility. And I think I saw that happening this summer.
Yep. There's statistics to show that. Yeah.
we always need statistics. So I'll say where I'm hopeful, Dave, and I'll say where I'm less hopeful. A couple of examples. One was a young person, Macy Brown, an 18-year-old African-American student from Jackson, Mississippi, organized a 5,000 person march in Jackson, Mississippi. This was the largest mass protest in Mississippi since the 1960s. That was very hopeful. That led directly to the removal of the Mississippi state flag that had the Confederate emblem in it that had been flying in Mississippi since 1896. That withstood the Charleston massacre that we just talked about, when South Carolina removed theirs from the old state capital, when Walmart removed Confederate flags from their stores. Mississippi stood strong. So something broke this summer, broke Mississippi in a good way, for that to be removed under a Republican administration in the House, the Senate, the state legislature, and in the governor's office. That was huge. I remember talking to a colleague at Jackson State University who had done all the data, had looked at all the polls. He said there's no way that the Mississippi state flag is changing. 3 months later, it changed. Incredible. That story has not been told very well in the national. It was huge here in Mississippi. Also in Mississippi, August 28th, the murder of Emmett Till's anniversary, the 65th anniversary, there was a local protest on the steps of the courthouse square in Sumner, Mississippi. Again, a town of 400 had 40 people come out to protest the Confederate statue that's on our courthouse lawn, and to march for Black Lives Matter. Earlier in the summer, a young person in our community had wanted to organize. They began to organize. They stopped their protest because they were still afraid of what would happen. They were still afraid, so that march got canceled. Someone else picked up the baton and made that happen. Just incredible for a town of 500 with our history that type of march. And Sumner's not alone. There was mass protests throughout the state of Mississippi in these little tiny towns throughout. That makes me very hopeful for our future. What I'm nervous about is the Republican Party. Senator Cochran was the head of the Appropriations Committee, is a Republican from Mississippi, passed away a couple years ago. He led the initiative to save our courthouse in Sumner, Mississippi, as a historical preservation project to bring it back to the way it looked in 1955 and to tell the truth around Emmett Till. He came down from Washington, D.C. to give the grand opening speech and did not mince words at all. He talked about Emmett Till. He talked about the brutality of what took place in Mississippi. And he said, we need to know this history. That's a different Republican Party than what we have today. And I think what we need to figure out is the Republican Party going to be the party of Trump, or is it going to be the party of Cochran and other more moderate Republicans who believe in truth, believe in science, believe in history, are not afraid of facts. And so I think we're yet to see that. But what happens is, if it remains the party of Trump, I think people will just say about half of our population is cut out, right? They're just going to completely ignore and make this a polarized issue. This is not polarized. This should not be a polarizing issue. Racism is evil, and both parties should be able to agree on that.
I love it, Patrick. You're right. We do need science, truth, and facts. But something I've learned from the three of you is that we also need art. And my next question is about this. In fact, I know that art has been important to your community in Sumner. I know it's been important to Glenn as a spoken word artist. And I know that Susan in her book comes out very strongly in favor of the role of art in this larger commemorative project. And so again, turn it over to any of you in whatever order you want to take it, to maybe help us think about the role of art in a self-critical memory practice.
Well, I think that art is always, the artists are at the vanguard of social change. And I just wanted to shout out Patrick. I saw that earlier this year he brought Patricia Smith, who was one of my idols, to talk about her work and the extensive poems that she's written about Emmett Till. The facts, the historical facts reach us intellectually, but the art, the music, it evokes an emotional response. And I think it's when you can touch somebody's heart that you start to see change take place. There's this remarkable painting at the Nelson that was done by a Jewish painter, Joseph Hirsch, back in 1946. And you see this Black woman who's holding a baby, and she's obviously distraught. There's this deep, rich blue background, and that's all you see, right? And so something horrible has happened, but what is it? Well, the title does the work. The title of the painting is Lynch Family. So then we know now that this woman has lost her husband, this baby has lost his father to a lynching. And I was so impacted by this painting. And Joseph Hirsch, who in 1946, this Jewish painter, to offer this commentary on lynching, I thought was extraordinary as well. And so I wrote this poem, and it's called Lynch Family Blues. Went out swinging last night, baby. Hope you didn't wait up for me. Said I was swinging all night, baby. Did you stay up late for me? I wasn't swinging in no joint, darling. I was out on the limb of a tree. Now I'm walking on air, baby. Feels almost like I'm free. My feet steady kicking the wind. Yeah, I'm close to being free. And for the first time in my life, baby, white folks is looking up to me. Hear me, son. Your daddy loves you. Keep hanging on to hope. You the man of the house now. Gotta help your mama cope. Daddy won't be coming home no more. I reached the end of my rope. And so of all the poems that I've written, that short poem has been requested in all of these different spaces for all of these different occasions because, you know, and I'm very thankful that that poem came through me. I was telling Dave before we started this conversation that that poem started off this long kind of rambling ballad, you know, kind of this narrative poem telling the story of this man who was a victim of lynching. And I just couldn't quite capture it. I just couldn't quite, you know, and once I started looking at the blue, the deep, rich blue background, it just hit me. Oh, it's a blues. I need to write a blues poem. And it just poured out of me, you know, and it just, I just am very grateful that it has resonated with people the way that it has. But yeah, to answer your question, I think art is vitally important. And a lot of the things that I say in poems, right? Like I got kicked out of Lincoln University in Jeff City for being a rabble rouser and giving these speeches. The same thing I would say in a speech that got me kicked out of a university, I can say in a poem and people clap. You know, it's art also does something in the way that we take in information, you know.
I don't have words other than thank you, Glenn, for sharing that. That was truly amazing. And Patrick, I hate to ask you to follow that, but I'm going to ask you to because I know art has played a role in Sumner as well.
Yeah, well, so my in-laws are photographers, and you got one behind me there as I'm talking, and they, you know, Maudie Clay, a fabulous photographer, dedicated her first book to Emmett Till, and is someone from Mississippi, from Sumner, whose family land is actually where Emmett Till's body came out of the Tallahatchie River. I think it is a very useful tool for even white people to be able to process what has taken place in this country. I would use one anecdote. We do a documentary film project with young people, not only for them to learn their local history, but for them to understand that their own personal story has a narrative, that we all have a narrative, and that we're the authors of our story, right? That the authority of where we're going is built into that. And so we had a young person, Devontae Wiley, young African-American student from Greenwood, Mississippi, did a documentary film project on an older white man in our community who still flies the Confederate flag inside his drugstore, just steps away from our courthouse where Milam and Bryant were let go free. And he was pretty nervous about it, wasn't sure how that experience as a young African-American documenting the life of an older white gentleman. But he did it anyways. He did it very passionately and did a really good just personal narrative of this guy, what his life was like. About halfway through the experience, the older shopkeeper asked him, you know, how do you feel about the flag? And Devontae knew what flag he was talking about, and he said, I hate it. It makes me sick. Every time I look at it, it just crushes me. Devontae, along with his other cohort, showed their films inside the courthouse where the injustice took place. They showed their own films of what it meant to be a young person in our community, back to the community. After the film project was over, the shopkeeper took down the Confederate flag from the shop, which is something, again, with these deep entrenched, growing up with the lost cause as this person did, knowing that he and his family had never done anything wrong, for them to completely go 180 and remove the Confederate flag was a huge piece. And I don't think it would have done, I could have told him, I could have given him 100 history books, and none of that would have mattered. But Devontae using art to be a persuasive tool to help process what has happened in our community and to be able to use it as a tool for change, I think it's the only way. And I think we need to double, triple, quadruple down on using arts and storytelling as the method for healing and for justice work in 2020.
I agree with both of you. I would put it just slightly different than Patrick put it. I think especially for white people, art is the way to go, because it is through actually understanding uh, Black people's stories that we have any sense, first of all, of what that world was like, but also that it's not that strange. I'm going to tell an anecdote, which is a little, weird, because it sounds like I'm saying I did everything right, which by no means did I. But when your adult child tells you that you raised them right in some sense, you got to be glad about this. And one of my kids lives in California now, and she was very involved in the Black Lives Matter demonstrations, and we were talking a lot. And she called me up one day and she said, Ma, you never told us not to be racist. You just gave me Maya Angelou's book, Life Doesn't Frighten Me, when I was 3, and it was my favorite book. And then you gave me Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye when I was much too young to, appreciate it. You shouldn't have done that. But still, I thought about that, and I thought, I did not say this is your diversity lesson. I did not say, I just said happy birthday, and this is literature you should read. And I think that is certainly part of what happened in Germany. That as Germans began to read memoirs of survivors and began to see a different story, they were able to, it played a huge role in their processing it. I wanted to just add one thing to something that Glenn said, because I agree with you entirely about the importance of language, even though I'm not a poet, but I did try to write. And one word that has been driving me crazy since I've started thinking about all of this is the word Jim Crow. I'm on a crusade to get rid of the word Jim Crow, because I think it it covers up what happened in the 100 years between the end of the Civil War and the passage of the Civil Rights Movement. Mm-hmm. It suggests, okay, we know there were racist caricatures and there was racial prejudice, but it doesn't talk about terror. Brian Stevenson uses the expression, the age of racial terror, which I think is absolutely right. I think many of us knew about Emmett Till, but until the work of the EJI, we had no idea how pervasive that was. And I think by using Jim Crow, we're just putting a sort of nice, kind of covering on what was actually terror and apartheid. So I wonder what you think about that.
I absolutely agree. And I'm so grateful for being on this panel, because we've been talking and using a lot of terms that I want to incorporate into my vernacular. But yeah, that makes all the sense in the world, what you just said. Jim Crow does kind of, you think of this caricature, you think of almost, in its historical context, it was comedic, right? And so that does take away from the true understanding of what was taking place during that epoch in history. So I appreciate
that. Be remiss not to note my good colleague here at KU, who has written about the ways that the term Jim Crow misgenders the violence as well, and suggests that it was a violence only directed towards men, when in fact it was a violence directed at women in powerful ways as well. One of the champions of art and social justice in Mississippi is the former director of the Museum of the Mississippi Delta, Cheryl Thornhill. And on her watch, Cheryl turned the longtime museum into a bastion of social justice. She hosted the For All the World to See exhibit, and really used art to do good work in the town of Greenwood. Cheryl put this question in the comments. She says she's really concerned about the Trump 1776 Commission, which this is my take on it, seems like a way to ensure that younger generations of America are not exposed to a self-critical memory practice. And she's asking the three panelists to respond to the commission. And I'll broaden it slightly. If you don't want to respond to Trump, maybe you could respond to both Trump and or how do we do the work of achieving a coherent national narrative at a time when we are so profoundly divided in America?
Well, it's the second part of your question that's so very hard. And I think many of us, I know I am, are still processing the fact that, Trump got the second largest number of voters in American history. It's very hard for me to understand. And I think, I think we ought to take time before we rush to conclusions. But I think the work is going on. I think that Black Lives Matter really did set something loose in June. But I think all of us who were made hopeful by that process also need to try to keep on working to make sure that it doesn't become this kind of, what shall I say, um, violent destruction of absolutely everything in American experience. And that it not become something abstract, that the whole cancel culture gets a little, called into question. And, that again, that's why I admire so much. I mean, I know a bit about Patrick's work. I just met Glenn. Admire these very local initiatives where you actually have a chance for people of different views to come together and to face both, learn more about their histories and think about the values. I mean, the thing about the whole heritage versus hate discussion is it's not about either. It's we don't memorialize every piece of our heritage. We memorialize the people we want our communities to value because they stood for particular values. And my hope is that if the people who are concerned about this learn again from somebody like Patrick, who really has amazing experience, and there are other people, he's not the only one, but working in quite hostile communities, to keep on insisting on the truth and on using the truth to come up with a different narrative of their communities. I think it's possible, but I think we need to push back on some of the aspects of cancel culture, and and also, as we all three of us said at the beginning, we also need to lift up American heroes too. We have to make it clear that this is not about America bashing. Okay, there are lots of things we can be proud of in this country. Just not necessarily Andrew Jackson say, or some of the things that Donald Trump thought we could be proud of.
Yeah, that is the question, and that's the gig. Like, how do you create a space for this kind of change to take place? I really kind of fell into this work. I've always been very interested in history and knowing more and studying more about Black history in particular and activism. But I do think that engaging the community in ways that are not always confrontational, but that can in some way bring together different thoughts of points of view. Bruce R. Watkins, really quickly, is our center. And Bruce R. Watkins, by the way, was an incredible cultural leader. He was the first person in Kansas City, a Black person to serve on the city council, the first Black person to run for mayor, was a huge advocate for social justice. So we celebrate his legacy here, along with African American history and art. But we are under the auspices of the Parks Department. We're managed by the Parks Department. And just next week, we're going to be hosting a conversation on how Kansas City can honor Dr. King's legacy. There was a big controversy. One of our main thoroughfares, Paseo Boulevard, was going to be renamed Martin Luther King Boulevard. because we were one of the few cities that doesn't have a Martin Luther King Boulevard, and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and the city council and other civic leaders decided that it was time. But people who lived in that community didn't feel that they had been engaged, both Black and white people who lived in that community, and the changes that it was going to require in terms of them changing their address and these other things and not being a part of that conversation, they pushed back against that. And so that didn't happen. So now Martin Luther King Boulevard will not be the Paseo. The Paseo will remain the Paseo. But the conversation is now, how do we honor Dr. King's legacy? And so we're going to have a community forum that's going to be facilitated by people who are skilled in conflict resolution to see how we can do a better job of honoring Dr. King's legacy, not only with the street name, but in policy and in programming and the things that we do. So you have to learn to be comfortable with the uncomfortable, and you have to try to create spaces where people with different opinions can come together and hopefully have a dialogue rather than, you know, a violent kind of confrontation.
So I'm thrilled to say out loud that our Q&A box is blowing up with interest over here. And so I'm going to try to tend to some of these questions. And let me say, first of all, that nothing has started the questions flowing as much as our discussion about art. And so a couple questions about art, remembrance, and justice to get us kicked off. And I'm going to combine, to start, a question from Ann Davison, who's coming in from New York City, with a question by the historian Alex Lichtenstein. And they're variants of the same question. One is put in abstract terms and one is put in very concrete terms. The abstract way to put it is this: if we're dealing with art and social justice, isn't there a danger that the art could trigger some, or sort of trigger some, or relaunch sort of traumas of the past, even looking at art similar to the painting you put up a few minutes ago, Joseph? There is a danger that people could be traumatized by that. And the more specific question has to do with the piece by Dana Schutz, who of course did an abstract rendering of the very traumatic, very brutal image from Jet magazine of Emmett Till in the casket. And so I'm not sure whether you want to address the abstract question of how art triggers us, or if you want to address the particular question of the Dana Schutz controversy. But I'd love to hear our panelists weigh in on these topics.
So I'll jump in on the Dana Schutz controversy, and it was a real, you know, it touched a nerve. I'll say that happened in the summer of 2016, kind of the aftermath of 2016, when that went out into the world, and immediate backlash as a white woman who had taken it on herself to try to empathize with Black pain through painting this very intimate moment. What I would say is, you know, I stand by her artwork. As an artist, I think that everybody should have the opportunity and the freedom to do what they want to as an artist. What I would push back on is the museum itself, its curation, who was in leadership. And I say that ironically as a white man who is at the Emmett Till Interpretive Center. We need more Black voices, not on the sidelines, but at the absolutely top level, helping inform decisions of museums and the narratives that are being shaped. I think that was the problem with the Dana Schutz controversy. Not that she painted Emmett Till, but that there was a curation staff that did not have enough sensitivity or realization of what that was going to do, and to maybe put that into a better context. And so That may or may not make sense, but I think there is definitely needs, and I think as referenced, Monument Lab and the work that the Mellon Foundation is doing to lift up Black museums and Black leadership at museums is pivotal. And I would say our organization is having lots of self-reflection on where we're going as a museum. How do we make sure that our board is representative and has representation with the Till family, specifically in positions of power and leadership?
I got it. Sorry, did you want to say something, Glenn? Go ahead.
No, go ahead, Susan, please.
So I got to disagree with Patrick for a change. I don't usually do that. Let me start by saying to the trauma question, I think the problem with Dana Schutz's painting was that it wasn't traumatic enough. It was not faithful to that image that we know and don't ever want to look at it again. It was so abstract that you could hang it on your wall if it weren't for the title of the painting. So that was my problem with the Dana Schutz painting, because I think art should, if it's going to be powerful, it should shake us up. I mean, think of a great painting like Picasso's Guernica, which, it's almost 100 years ago, but it shocked people because of this aerial bombing of civilians, which was a new thing. I mean, they basically just invented airplanes and bombers, right? It's hard for us to feel that today, but I think that art has to upset us sometime, or it's not doing its job. So I'm really, really not fond of too many trigger worries. But I'm also really not fond of the accusation of cultural appropriation. And, I think, and I interviewed Chris Benson on this subject because it was right during the controversy when I was down there. Chris Benson was the co-author, I suspect largely the author of Mamie Till Mobley's autobiography. And I asked him what he thought, and Whitney had actually invited him to come and talk about it. He said, that's why Mamie left the casket open. She wanted people to see. Obviously, she didn't just want to touch Black people. She wanted to touch everyone. And so I one of the arguments that I think is most problematic at the moment are arguments about cultural appropriation. Culture is, obviously there's exploitation. So let's distinguish between appropriation and exploitation. But, culture isn't doing its job if it doesn't reach everyone, and it's not universal. If it can't in some ways, be played with by everyone and created by everyone. Obviously, I agree with Patrick in saying that we need more representation of people of color and positions of power. But I'm a universalist, and that's a position that often gets overlooked at this particular moment in time. And I think it's a big part of our problem, because as soon as we start seeing things only in terms of demography, only in terms of, ethnic background, that's where white supremacy can say, well, hey, and that's what they say, by the way, if other people can defend their ethnic group, I'm just defending mine.
So you all touched upon everything that I had planned on saying about that.
Sorry.
No, that's fine. That's fine. But when art is so subjective, but when you get the sense that there is exploitation, or someone who's just, for shock value, presenting something, that's one thing. But if it's something that does trigger or really cause us to feel some sense of pain or discomfort, I do think that is part of the work of art. You can't fix what you won't face, and I think that art oftentimes makes us confront those things that are really difficult and uncomfortable and painful. And I think that's part of the work of art.
Can't fix what you won't face. That's going to be a takeaway for me, I'll tell you right now.
Yeah.
That Dana Schutz, for those of you who don't know the story, Dana Schutz did the painting based on a photograph taken by a photographer who worked for Johnson Publications named David Jackson, who snapped a picture of Till's body in the casket. And nothing excites controversy in the world of Till commemoration as much as that photograph. The famous UCLA historian Robin D.G. Kelly says it is unethical to view that picture, whereas just south of Patrick, down in Glendora, Mississippi, Mayor Johnny Thomas says it's unethical not to show that picture. And so like we have both extremes going on here. And this pushes me to a question from, let me see, a woman named Abby Glogauer, forgive me if I said your name wrong, joining us from Louisville, Kentucky. And she points out that the artist Joseph Hirsch, that Glenn's poem was based on, shares something in common with the artist David Jackson that that Dana Schutz's painting was based on, and that both of them in their own various ways were blacklisted or marginalized for so-called communist sympathies. And what she's asking is, the moment an artist gets into the game, it seems that so often they are immediately marginalized, or a red herring like communism comes along. And so she's asking us to think about, how can we protect the artist who's trying to do this work when it seems like art and social justice is such a precarious way to approach commemoration?
I think part of it goes to what Susan and Patrick were saying about Black people, people of color, disenfranchised people being in leadership roles. I know that one of the things that we're struggling with in the arts community here in Kansas City is not enough representation on boards, not enough representation in terms of the administration of the various art and culture institutions that exist here, and it's a real problem. And you know, I call it the cutthroat world of arts and humanities. I mean, who knew, you know, how political and how deep and how scathing some of these arguments and things could be as it pertains to art. But having said that, I think that if we work harder to put the right people in leadership, then that opens that creates an opportunity for artists to their authentic selves when they are dealing with political or social justice issues. I think that we have to have some representation internally to kind of create I don't even know the word I'm looking for at this point, but so that artists have that freedom to do what the work that they feel that they're called to do without fear of repercussion.
Yeah, and I would say, you know, Chris Benson is a great example of somebody who, you know, when he came out very strongly and said exactly what Susan said, that and he's a Black man, and also I think of a Jewish descent as well. And he you know, he was very, very open and said, I wrote Mamie Till's autobiography with her, and she wanted the world to see. And not just the Black world, not just the white world. She wanted the world to see what happened to her child. And so we need advocates to say artists have the freedom and they should be pushing the limits no matter where those limits go. I think that there was the backlash that happened after Dana Schutz probably gave a lot of white artists pause not to be courageous, not to go into places. That doesn't mean that we should take all white art and keep putting it on a pedestal like we have for generations and generations. But it does mean that we need to go there as a society. And if we have such a cancel culture, which, you know, we could talk an entire panel on that. If people are too afraid to speak, then that's not the solution either.
I would agree with both of you, but I'd like to add something which might put off a number of listeners, but I've got to say it. You know, Patrick, you're certainly right that there was a big, you know, ruckus, certainly in the art world and beyond, about the Dana Schutz painting. But there's nothing in the United States that is more dangerous than saying anything that comes within spitting distance of communism or socialism wasn't entirely evil. That is the real taboo in this country. It's happening now with Kelly Loeffler trying to destroy Raphael Warnock in the most important Senate election of the century, for sure. And, this is a part of our past, the Cold War and what we did that we haven't looked at. One of my favorite artists in, American history is Paul Robeson. Paul Robeson, in the middle of the 20th century, W.E.B. Du Bois, who was a friend of his, W. Bois, everybody called him the most famous Black man in the world. W.D. Du Bois called him the most famous American in the world. He was, his reach was extraordinary. His talents were basically superhuman. And he's been virtually wiped out of history, not because he was a Black man, but because he was a socialist. And he, was absolutely unashamed about that. And I think you can point to a lot of other examples in American history where that was the thing that did people in. And I think we need to start speaking up about that and not being afraid of being, tarred with a brush of, being absolutely beyond the pale.
Thank you for saying that, Susan. I couldn't agree more. Here's a question from Howard Ball, Mississippi State. And it's a question I want Glenn to take up first, and then we'll see where it goes from there. Here's the question. How can local conversations like truth and reconciliation meetings overcome some of the fundamental controversies between groups in 2020?
Well, like I said, that's the gig. I think that one of the things that I had to confront with being one of the founders of the Community Remembrance Project here in Missouri is that even all of the people who were at the table, there have been some conflicts between, different people who were there. There was history, different organizations, sometimes cultural institutions, especially small Black ones are oftentimes kind of struggling for those same dollars. And there's this competitive element. And so for me, the first time that we met and was we probably had about 30 people at that meeting representing different organizations, different political factions in the city, you name it. And I just said that I know that there's a lot of history here. I know that there's some conflicts that have happened between individuals and institutions here. And so internally, we have to be willing to do the work of reconciliation if we're going to be calling upon the community to do the same. I think that you have to have the right people on the bus. You have to have people who understand how to facilitate difficult conversations, people who know how to kind of keep the temperature in the room at a safe level. And you have to really make sure that you do your homework and understanding all of the different nuances. Susan talking about, political affiliation being something else that caused people to be disenfranchised and left out of the history books as opposed to just race was something that I hadn't thought seriously about, but I will now. So it's very important to do the homework and to really understand whatever issue it is that you're confronting, all of the different ways in which people are kind of thinking about it so that you can create a context where a productive conversation can take place.
Yeah, I mean, it's the most difficult, slow, frustrating work you can imagine. But I don't see any other solution. And it's helpful when it's on the local level, right? Because you can get past some of the polarizations. You can bring people together that are unlikely, on maybe to agree on anything else nationally, but about their community, they can all say they love their community and they want to see it do well. I think it takes that relationships. It takes takes the trust building in order to tell the truth. In order to tell the truth and actually have someone listen to it, you have to do that relationship building and that work before you start anything like that, which is why we use the example of the William Winter Institute for Racial Reconciliation that was founded after President Clinton's initiative on race that John Hope Franklin and Governor Winter co-led together. But there's this idea that you have to have relationships and trust building in order to have that bridge to honest action. And that's what we saw in Philadelphia. That's what we're trying to do here in Sumner, Mississippi. It's not sexy work. It's not fun, fabulous work. It's the nitty gritty of democracy. But if we truly want a democratic society, this is where we have to lean into. So it's messy and it takes a long time, but the outcomes are incredible, right? It lifts the veil. It allows for communities to thrive. It creates new narratives, and it's the only way we can go.
Yeah, these guys are the activists. I've just written something about it. So, and I'm very impressed with what I saw in Mississippi. So,
we're the patriots. We're not activists. You don't say activists in Mississippi. Get killed for being an activist. I'm a patriot.
Words matter.
These guys are on the ground. Can you say they're working on the ground?
Let's talk about that ground. And I say that because we have a number of questions here about what we might think of as various sacred memory spaces. Virginia Cleary has brought up a few of them in the comments, from places like Monticello, obviously a vexed site, to places like the relatively new lynching memorial that EJI did in Montgomery. A listener named Jillian Knowles has put a couple questions up about the role of Glendora, Mississippi. Again, just down the road from Patrick, it's the site of the only museum in the world that's entirely dedicated to the Till story. It's a sacred spot in its own right, of course. And so this question to the panelists is about the role of sacred spaces. And you can either engage the particular sites that have been mentioned, or if you prefer, just to talk about the role of like being on site, because I noticed that in both Kansas City and Mississippi, right? You guys are not just publishing tracts or writing songs, you're actually like redeeming particular places and building things, right? So let's think about the role of these sacred sites.
So I know that there are some photographs of the Levi Harrington Memorial. Levi Harrington was a gentleman who was lynched here in Kansas City, Missouri in 1882, who the next day was found to be innocent. And the place where we decided to erect the memorial was the place where people had gathered to watch the lynching. EJI uses the term racial terror lynchings. You know, lynchings took place in America, but a racial terror lynching involved the spectacle. It involved, you know, the kind of carnival atmosphere where people were picnicking and had their children on their shoulders so that they could see the bodies hang, where they would even cut off appendages and keep them as souvenirs and make postcards and things. So we felt that that was the appropriate space for the marker. And I know that you had to deal with this a lot, Patrick. The memorial was vandalized. It's been up since 2018. First, there was some graffiti on it. And then just earlier this year, someone took a saw, cut it off at the base, and then threw it over onto a hill, very similar to the way Levi Harrington's body was cut down and just left to rot. And so we just have done the best that we can at this point to involve the community, to help the community to police the space. I want to talk to Patrick some more about, you know, things that, you know, he's enacted to protect the Emmett Till Memorial. The picture that you see there is one after the marker had been deinstalled after it had been vandalized. Someone in the community wrote this beautiful poem there on the concrete. And so we feel that our job now is to, just persevere. We're in the process of getting the marker redone. Levi Harrington was lynched on April the 3rd, 1882. So we want to have a rededication ceremony, April 3rd of 2021. And yeah, it just really, as Patrick was saying, as hopeful as I am, the fact that someone so heinously vandalized this particular marker, and then the response that we got from the local police in terms of it being kind of a, well, it's probably just some crazy kids, but when someone put graffiti on the Andrew Jackson statue in front of City Hall downtown, they found the perpetrators the next day. They took that very seriously. So for a while, I kind of had this internal debate going on in terms of like the importance of these monuments and why so much attention is being placed on them, when to me there are much larger issues that need to be discussed. But at the same time, when you talk about narrative, when you talk about the power of symbols and all of those things, it's a very important discussion to have. And it certainly hit home when the marker was vandalized, but we definitely want to protect that. And we do use the term sacred space because we feel that that's exactly what it is.
Yeah, I just want to touch on one thing that Glenn said is, in our case, our sign's been vandalized multiple times. The last time was by a group of 18 and 19-year-old white students from Ole Miss, University of Mississippi. They are still students at Ole Miss. They haven't been kicked out. They have never. They posed with guns in front of the marker. Jerry Mitchell, who I think one of his colleagues is in the chat bar, ran a great expose about this. The Mississippi Civil Rights Report of Investigative Journalism group. I got your name wrong, but they do incredible work. And the white power structure protected them, right? And so here's a great clip of two Black students from the University of Mississippi who decided to have their own panel discussion on campus to push back against that culture of white supremacy that it still exists at the University of Mississippi. And they decided to bring it to the Confederate statue on that campus, which they removed, but they removed it in a way where they're creating a park to memorialize the Confederacy. It is very difficult to do this work anywhere in the country. It's very difficult in Mississippi. People like Johnny B. Thomas, who was mentioned, the Black politicians who run in areas where there's been racial terror, we wouldn't exist were it not for Jerome Little, the first Black board supervisor, Robert Grayson, the first Black mayor of Tutwiler. Those folks who've been doing the hard work have allowed for this moment to take place. And you can see this picture of, a group of, white men protecting the Confederate statue as a group of Black activists, and some white people as well, try to push back on the generational lost cause. And the lost cause is not just that statue, it's the indoctrination that our entire culture and society was indoctrinated in white supremacy. And it's the water that we swim in, and we have to grapple with that and open up our eyes and our neighbors' eyes to that reality.
I think we all have this question about how important are these monuments. After all, it's only symbols. But I was listening to a voting rights activist on the radio the other day talk about how many kids feel their vote doesn't matter, and why should they even try? And he said, if your vote didn't matter, they wouldn't try so hard to take it away from you. And I think the same thing is true of the monuments. I mean, if you see these things being destroyed, and we have another set of pictures about some monuments in Germany. I wonder if we can see the Stolpersteine, the stumbling stones. And there's an interesting way in which they are not sacred space. They are very much anti-sacred space. These are thousands of brass plaques put in front of buildings where Jews or other people who were deported and murdered by the Nazis once lived. And it has their name, their date of birth, and their date of deportation and date of death, if it's known. And what is so striking about these is that they are in the middle of the city, or of different cities, and they tell you, what happened. Let's not think about, the end of Nazi terror and the murder in concentration camps way off far away. It started here. It started right where you live, right where you go to the market. And, that's where we need to act. And like Brian Stevenson told me, is very influenced by the stumbling stones in Germany. And the whole idea of the double set of columns, and the columns that you can take home to your county if you do the work, came from the stumbling stones, because they're not very expensive. It costs about maybe it's like $130. You can ask to have a stone put in front of your house, but you have to research the person's life. You have to find out about them. You have to do the work too. And it's been enormously powerful, exactly because it's not sacred space. But on the topic of sacred space, I've got to say the most awesome, and I mean that, I use that word rarely, awesome memorial I have ever seen in my life is the National Lynching Memorial. It's worth a trip to Montgomery, Alabama. I think they squared the circle. It is a monument that both does justice to the horror of lynching and the importance of lynching. And I think most people who go in there cry. I know I certainly did. But it doesn't leave you feeling hopeless when you go out. On the contrary, it somehow creates this sense of, and okay, it manages to create energy, that makes you think. I think he even ends it by saying, "We shall overcome, with hope, because we shall overcome." So yeah, nothing rivals that. I know that he studied monuments in Germany and in Rwanda and in South Africa, but he managed to create something absolutely unique and extraordinary there.
Yeah, I will underscore those comments about the power and literal awesomeness of the EJI Memorial. Well, you're not going to believe it, but we've had about 100 people on board for 90 minutes. And given that we've done this in the middle of the workday in the United States and over the dinner hour in Germany, I take that as profound encouragement. And so thank you to all of you. Thank you for your questions. We were able to get to about a third of them. And I apologize if we did not get to your questions. One more shout out to our panelists, Susan Neiman, Glenn North, Patrick Weems. One more shout out to the book. I don't know if you can see it on my screen. It's called Learning from Germany, Race and the Memory of Evil. And now I'm going to pitch it back to Yuda, who's going to tell us what's coming up in the series.
Thank you so much. I also like to play this and show all the books you actually should read. So Dave, I would like to show you a book as well, of course. So I encourage everybody to read all of that. Thank you so much. Dave was right. So the Q&A box was exploding, and we have to excuse very much for everybody whose question we couldn't take. We'll try to secure these questions and pass them on to our panelists, as well as we got the question for Glenn's poem. And Glenn, if you would be able maybe to share this with us, the text, we would be happy to send the text to all of you who are interested. Maybe you just shoot us an email. We will post the info email address of the Goethe pop-up in the chat for you. And let me just say a couple more things besides all of my thank yous. To our panelists and to all of you. Great to see so many people. So please see more from Glenn North, since you were so interested in him and his poem especially, but maybe his work. We did an extraordinary project, I think a video which belongs to a series that is called Counter Memories. And the Counter Memories Kansas City episode talks about the Levi Harrington Memorial Marker. And it's a conversation between Glenn North and his colleague from the Community Remembrance Project, Stacy Pratt. And there you can even expect a little bit more than a virtual dialogue, because the discussion between Glenn Stacy and a German journalist is enriched with lots of material, such as photos, videos, archival material, and you will be able to listen to this poem one more time. And for this, we also just posted the link to the YouTube channel, to the YouTube video in the chat. And maybe I can tell you a little secret. Susan Neiman will be in one of the upcoming Counter Memories episodes. So watch out for this. And she will do something in Berlin. That's what I know. And maybe you're interested to meet Patrick Weems, once again this week on Thursday, together with Keith Beauchamp, the director of the documentary, The Untold Story of Emmett Louis Till. And they would like to discuss together with you how to commemorate the past through film, and how film can even be used as a medium of activism. So art as a medium of activism. Thank you so much again to Susan, Glenn, Patrick, and Dave, and to Julia behind the scenes. And thank you so much to all of you. We hope to see you again soon at the Goethe Pop-Up Kansas City's virtual world right now. Goodbye, auf Wiedersehen, and good night to Susan in Germany.
Thank you for organizing this, Jutta. This was lovely.
Thank you very, very much for all of you. Thanks.
Thank you, Jutta. Thank you, Julia. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye.